On the back wall of a temple sanctuary, carved into limestone and painted in colors that have held for more than 3,000 years, a king stands face to face with a god. He is holding something out in front of him, a loaf of bread, or a small seated figure of the goddess of truth, or a tall jar of wine. The figure across from him is holding something back toward the king, a looped cross pressed close to the king's face, which the Egyptians drew to mean the breath of life. A long notched rib of palm, which meant years beyond counting. Below their hands, a short column of signs spells out what passes between them. This scene is everywhere. Some version of it covers the inner walls of nearly every great temple still standing in Egypt, at Karnak, at Abydos, at Edfu, at Philae, repeated so many times that it stops reading like a record and starts reading like pattern. That repetition is the first thing worth slowing down for. Those walls were doing more than decorating a room. Each scene is a transaction caught at the exact moment of exchange, showing what one side handed over and what the other handed back. The question this video sits inside is the one those walls keep answering while almost no one stops to hear it. Who stood on the other side of that exchange? What the Egyptians believed they were dealing with when a king lifted his hands toward a god, and, in the texts themselves, what those beings were said to promise in return. Some of what follows is solid and documented, carved in stone and written on papyrus that you can still go and read for yourself. Some of it is theory, and where the ground turns soft, I will say so out loud. The version most of us carry is straightforward. Ancient Egypt was a deeply religious civilization with a crowded sky of gods, and the pharaoh sat at the head of that religion as its chief priest. The offerings on the temple walls were acts of devotion. The king worshipped, the gods were worshipped, and the whole arrangement was piety on a national scale. That picture holds until you read the texts in the order they were written, using the plain meaning of the words. What they describe has less in common with worship than with a contract. Obligations run in both directions. Each side is required to provide specific things. Consequences are written down for the side that fails to provide them, and witnesses are named to hold the whole arrangement in place. The relationship the Egyptians recorded between their kings and their gods went well beyond adoration shouted up at a distance. It was a binding agreement, with terms, and both parties were held to it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To see how far back that agreement was thought to reach, start with a single fragile object held in a museum in Turin. It is a papyrus, broken into more than 150 pieces, listing the kings of Egypt in order and running backward through time. Scholars call it the Turin Royal Canon, and for the historical pharaohs it lines up reasonably well with what is known from other sources. The strange part is what the list does before it reaches any human king at all. Above the first mortal ruler, the same document keeps counting. It records a line of gods said to have ruled on earth directly. Below them, a second tier of beings, the blessed dead and the spirits. And then, just before the first human dynasty, a group the Egyptians named the Followers of Horus, the Shemsu Hor. The scribe gave them reign lengths. He treated them as rulers who held the land in their own right, in the same ledger, in the same hand, as the kings who came after them. To the people who kept these records, the deep past was not empty before the pharaohs. It was governed, and it was governed by beings they did not count as human. Who the followers of Horus actually were is one of the real open questions of Egyptology, and no one has closed it. The same idea surfaces on other genuine objects. The Palermo Stone, a slab of black rock carved with royal annals, lists pre-dynastic rulers from before the unified kingdom. The wall of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos carries a list of 76 predecessors, the line of kingship reaching back toward its source. The Egyptians built their own origin as a chain, and at the far end of the chain they placed not founders but gods, with the followers of Horus standing in the gap between the divine rulers and the first men to wear the crown. There is even a text that records how the throne first changed hands. A slab of dark stone in the British Museum, copied around the 8th century before the Common Era from a far older and worm-eaten document, preserves what scholars call the Memphite theology. It tells how the gods themselves sat in judgment over a dispute for the kingship, and how the throne of Egypt was awarded to Horus by their decision. Every living king after that ruled as Horus on earth, holding a seat that had been settled in a divine court. Read beside the offering scenes, it sets out the first clause of the whole agreement. The right to rule was granted by the gods, in judgment, and handed down from there to every king who followed. Whatever those beings were, the agreement with them had to be maintained, and the maintenance never stopped. In every temple, every single day, priests performed the same service on the statue of the god housed in the dark inner room. The statue was woken at dawn. It was washed, it was dressed in fresh linen, painted, perfumed, and set before a meal of bread, meat, beer, and wine. Then it was sealed away again until the next morning, when the whole sequence began over. This was not occasional ceremony. It was daily upkeep of a standing obligation, and the Egyptians stated the logic of it plainly. The king feeds the gods, and the gods in turn hold the world in place. The principle even carries a name that scholars borrowed from Latin to describe it: do ut des, I give so that you may give. The offering was the king's half of a running account, and the return on that account was the order of the universe itself. Whether the Egyptians pictured this as literally nourishing living beings, or as something closer to symbol and duty, is a real and active debate. The shape of the deal is not in doubt. Something was owed, daily, and something enormous was understood to depend on it being paid. There is one offering on those walls that makes the exchange unmistakable. In scene after scene, the king holds up a small seated figure of Ma'at herself, the goddess who is also the principle of order, and presents her to the god. What he raises in that moment is order itself, the very thing the gods were thought to grant the world, handed back to them as a sign that the account is balanced and the bargain is being kept. The Egyptians had a single image for the whole arrangement, and it was a king returning order to the beings who had given it to him. The agreement did not end at the edge of the king's life. It had a clause for what came after, and that clause is written in the oldest religious literature on earth. Carved into the walls of the burial chambers inside the pyramids, beginning more than 4,000 years ago, are the spells we call the pyramid texts. They are instructions and declarations for the dead king, written to carry him up out of the tomb and into the company of the gods. He climbs to the sky and joins the imperishable stars, the ones that never set. A ferryman waits to carry him across the water, but only after the king names the man correctly. Gates stand in his path, and each keeper has to be addressed with the right words before it will open. At every stage, knowing the name and knowing the formula is what grants passage. Read as part of the larger bargain, this is the king collecting on the far end of it. He spent his life maintaining the offerings and upholding the order the gods required of him. The promise written into his tomb is that, in exchange, he is not simply gone. He takes a seat among the beings he served, becomes one of them, and keeps his place in the sky. Where this stops being something anyone can verify is plain enough. We can read exactly what the Egyptians wrote down and exactly what they expected to receive. We cannot stand where they stood and see what they believed they saw. The text is solid. The thing it points at is sealed behind 3,000 years. For the single most concrete proof that the Egyptians treated their gods as parties to an agreement, leave the temples and the tombs entirely and look at a piece of international law. In the 13th century before the Common Era, Ramesses II of Egypt and the king of the Hittites signed a peace treaty ending years of war between their two empires. It survives. The Egyptian version is carved on the walls at Karnak, and the Hittite version was found on a clay tablet in the ruins of their capital, written in cuneiform. It is the earliest surviving peace treaty between two nations anywhere in the world, and historians treat it as exactly that, a real diplomatic document with real signatories. What it says at the end is the part that belongs in this story. The treaty does not only bind the two kings. It calls on the gods of Egypt and the gods of Hatti, 1,000 of them on each side, to stand as witnesses to the agreement, and it gives them a job to do. The gods are written in as the enforcement clause. Whoever breaks the treaty, the text declares, the 1,000 gods will destroy his house, his land, and his servants. Whoever keeps it, the 1,000 gods will keep him alive and prosperous. That is the binding mechanism of a legal contract between two superpowers, written in plain terms, and the mechanism is divine. Whatever the Egyptians and the Hittites believed about their gods, they believed it firmly enough to make those beings the guarantors of a peace that thousands of lives rested on. The seam runs through what they believed, which we cannot fully recover. The document, and the role it hands to the gods, is beyond dispute. The same Ramesses left behind a second account of that war, and it shows the other side of the bargain in action. On temple walls across Egypt, the poem of Kadesh describes the king surrounded and cut off in battle, his army scattered around him, and in that moment he calls out by name to the god Amun. The text has Amun answer him, reaching from the temple at distant Thebes to put strength into the king's arm and turn the fight. Whatever happened on that field, the way Ramesses chose to record it is exact. He had kept up the offerings and the temples his whole reign. When he called, the god he had served was bound to answer, and the victory was the promise being kept. The treaty named the gods as witnesses. The poem showed the king collecting on them in the worst hour of his life. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. An agreement that runs for a lifetime needs a way to be renewed, and the Egyptians built one of those as well. They called it the Sed Festival, the Royal Jubilee, and a king who had held the throne long enough, traditionally about 30 years, would stage it. At its center, the aging king reenacted his own coronation. He ran a fixed ritual course in front of the assembled court and the images of the gods, a physical demonstration that his strength and his right to rule were still intact. He was crowned a second time. His power was renewed by the same gods who had granted it at the start. Set inside the larger bargain, the Jubilee reads like a renewal clause being exercised. The king returned to the table, proved he had upheld his half, and the dominion he held was granted again for another term. Kingship in Egypt worked as a grant rather than a possession kept forever. It had to be earned a second time, and the festival was the ceremony where the earning was done. If the festival was the renewal, there was also an audit, and the audit produced the most precise statement of the agreement's terms the Egyptians ever set down. In the funerary collection we call the Book of the Dead, one section, spell 125, describes the dead arriving in a hall to be judged. The heart of the deceased is placed on a scale and weighed against a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth and order itself. 42 divine judges stand in the hall, each one assigned to a specific wrong. The dead person has to address them and declare, one wrong at a time, the things he did not do. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied against another man. I have not held back water that was owed. I have not falsified the scales. That long recital, the part scholars call the negative confession, is the clearest surviving statement of what the agreement actually required. It is the contract read back as a checklist, item by item, with the dead swearing to each line. Pass the audit and the promise on the other side came due. Fail it, and the same texts are blunt about what waited instead. The terms were never vague. They were written down, set in order, and recited by name, and a person's whole existence after death was staked on having kept them. The reading that treats this hall as the audit of a standing agreement is the frame this channel is putting around it, and that frame is where the documented record ends and interpretation begins. Stand all of these pieces next to each other and the same figure keeps appearing on the far side of the deal. The Egyptians called them netjeru. Kings dealt with them directly, face to face on the temple walls, one hand outstretched toward another. They were fed daily. They were named as witnesses in treaties between empires. They were the judges in the Hall of the Scales. And in the king lists they were something more than powers to be honored from below. They were the ones who had held the land themselves, at the beginning, before the agreement passed into human hands. The followers of Horus sit right at that handover, the last rulers before the first dynasty, the hinge between the beings who governed directly and the men who governed under terms. So here is what the Egyptians actually left behind, read in their own sequence and their own words. The record of a binding, two-sided agreement between their rulers and beings they considered entirely real, set down with the same care a scribe gave to the reign of a king. The kings owed offerings, every day, without fail. They owed the temples, the upkeep, the rituals, and above all the holding of order against chaos. In return, the whole civilization depended on what the beings on the other side were said to promise: life in this world and beyond death, dominion for the king, victory in war sworn under divine witness, the return of the sun each morning, and the river each year, and a seat among the gods for the ruler who kept his word to the end. Underneath all of it, written into the same ledgers as the human kings, sits the claim that these same beings had once ruled the land directly before handing it down. The bolder reading, and this is the bolder reading, goes one step past the documents. It asks whether the agreement was made with something that was actually present. Whether the followers of Horus were not a story invented after the fact, but a worn-down memory of real rulers from before written history. Whether what the texts record as a promise was, in some literal sense, a deal that was struck. That step cannot be proven, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. This is a channel about the questions the ancient world has not fully answered. Some of what we have looked at is solid and documented, and I have tried to mark it as such along the way. The rest is theory, and the aim was never to hand you a verdict. It was to show you what is carved on those walls, and let you decide for yourself what it means. What stays open is the part the records cannot close on their own. We still do not know who the followers of Horus really were, or what older tradition the Egyptians were preserving when they wrote a line of divine rulers into their own history with reign lengths attached to each one. What a king believed was happening when he stood in the dark of the sanctuary and lifted his hands toward the statue is lost with him. What the Egyptians thought they were renewing every 30 years when they crowned a living man for a second time in front of the images of the gods went into the ground with the last of them. The offerings are carved where anyone can stand and see them. The treaties survive, in stone and in clay. The lists are still here, in museums in Turin and Palermo, and on a temple wall at Abydos at this very moment. The agreement they describe is laid out in detail. The one thing none of it records is who, exactly, the Egyptians believed was standing on the other side of that exchange, holding out the loop of life and the promise of years beyond counting. That scene is still on the wall, the king with his hands full of bread and wine, the figure across from him offering back the breath of life, and between their hands, a short column of signs spelling out terms that were kept, every day, for 3,000 years, by a civilization that never once wrote down what it believed it was speaking to. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.